I think the impact of visual images or of social media or of films is something we really have to consider very hard. You know, it's very easy to make films and over-exaggerate their impact. My name is Phil Grabsky. I'm a filmmaker, and what that means, of course, for me is I'm a cinematographer, I'm a writer, I'm a director, I'm a producer, and I'm a distributor. But all told, I'm a filmmaker. We're overwhelmed with information. We're overwhelmed with visual information. So it takes something special to kind of register with you. Afghanistan had been an ongoing situation. There'd been, you know, the Russians, the Mujahideen, but actually it was the visual reference of the Buddhas of Bamiyan, the biggest stone statues in the world, being destroyed, that registered with me in March 2001. By coincidence, completely by coincidence, my co-director of this film, I discovered was the person who filmed the Buddhas being blown up, which was a dangerous thing to do. You weren't allowed to film it, but he did. So Afghanistan was in my mind. Of course, 9/11 then happened. So March was 2001, the Buddhas were blown up, September 9/11. I know, like everybody, I guess, I know exactly where I was. I was making a feature film about Muhammad Ali and in London. And the first plane went in and we all thought it was an accident. The second plane went in, I got in my car and drove home. Again, like so many people, I just felt this instinctive need to be with my family because I didn't know what was going on. And then a few weeks later, of course, Afghanistan, there was this coalition, American, NATO, 40 countries ultimately, that helped the Northern Alliance kick the Taliban out. And that was the point I thought to myself as a filmmaker, who are the Afghans really? And then I decided to get on a plane and go and find out for myself. But of course, the essence of filmmaking is the visual image. And arriving in Afghanistan early in 2002, I mean, the visual possibilities were overwhelming. This was a country that had been completely destroyed, which visually was extraordinarily rich in some ways. So what you had to do in a way was find your way through the visual images to the core of a film, which is the story. And for me, the story was an 8-year-old boy. So, to the best of my knowledge, I was the first filmmaker to go into Afghanistan after the fall, as it was then called, of the Taliban at the end of 2001. And I went in search of a story. My motivation was to find out as much as I possibly could about who the Afghans were. I went on my own, but with an Afghan translator fixer. I had a lot of curiosity, I had a lot of energy, but I didn't know what the story would be. But I'd been making films long enough to know that it doesn't matter how worthy, how important a subject is, people want to be entertained, they need a good narrative, they need a good story. I don't really just want to make films for people who are already interested in that subject. I want to make films for people who hadn't really thought about Afghanistan before in this case. So my desire to find a story, to keep this story short, meant I went to Bamiyan, which was somewhere that people had heard of because of the destruction of the stone Buddhas. But this was somewhere that had I been there a few months earlier, I would have been arrested. I didn't know how people would react to me filming. The first morning after I arrived, really quite early, I went on my own actually without my fixer because he was asleep. I went down to the Buddhas to have a look with my camera, and there were 3 men with shovels, and they were actually cleaning up the rubble. And I put my camera on the tripod. I didn't even attach it in case I'd have to run. And I thought, right, I'm going to start filming now. So this is tape number 1, shooting on videotape. I thought, I'm going to start filming. Let's see what they do. I'm a runner, so I know that if they start coming for me with their shovels, I know I can outrun them. And I started filming, and they all started singing at me, and one of them even jumped into a wheelbarrow and started dancing. So immediately I thought, okay, put away your preconceptions. This is never going to be what you expect it to be. But at the same time, what I hadn't even noticed was that there was a group of small boys, 5 small boys, and one of them on that very first tape actually looks down the lens. And in fact, the little clip of this is at the beginning of the film. And this little boy, these boys, but this boy in particular, he stayed around me as I filmed over the next 2 or 3 days. And gradually, and he was very smiley, very attractive, had a lovely hat. And gradually I realized that I wasn't going to be able to find a story of an adult male because they were exhausted, they were depressed, and they weren't doing anything. Adult females were very difficult to make a film about, really. And I suddenly realized, and it's probably the best decision I've made in 35 years of filmmaking, he's the story, this kid. Because if I make a film about him, then my audience is thinking about the future. I have a very clear narrative, which is him getting older. We immediately are sympathetic towards him because he's such a cheeky, smiley, happy young boy. And what I'd hoped and exceeded my wildest dreams was that a kid will go places that an adult wouldn't. So one of my favorite all-time scenes of anything that I've filmed, and I've filmed 4 films about composers, 30 films about feature films about artists, and many other things. One of my favorite all-time scenes was Mir's very first swim, the first time he ever went swimming in water. And you have to see it in the film, but he basically blows up his own trousers to give him some kind of, where did he learn to do that? I remember filming it thinking, this is the most extraordinary thing. And over the next 20, it wasn't intended to be 20 years, but over the next 20 years, it's always surprising. He's always getting up to, it's always a new adventure. And through him, you learn an enormous amount about Afghanistan. And recently our British Parliament discussed Afghanistan, and I sent every single MP the film. Because I thought so many of you talk about Afghanistan, but you don't know anything about it. You've never been. But you express an opinion. Okay, you're allowed to, but at least the purpose of a film is to give you, I have to digest all this information and then provide you something in 90 minutes, which at least gives you greater grounds to express a more considered opinion of what we should do in situations like this. And he's been the most remarkable companion over those 20 years. You ask me, what is my relationship to him? Naturally very, very close. And my co-director, who lives in Kabul, Shoaib Sharifi, without whom I could not have made this film. I mean, they're like family now. How do you tell the story of one person's life over 20 years? Imagine your life, someone's filmed you on and off for 20 years. What bits do you include and what do you leave out? And then trying to put that in a general context. So what would you say about Germany over the last 20 years? So which bits of news footage do you include? Any sport? Is it just Merkel? How much do you do about the refugees? How much do you do about economics? So creatively, extraordinarily challenging. And that's what I really enjoy, actually. I enjoy that challenge. What is really tough, though, is and almost insurmountable is the funding to make the films, or the value that the films are then given by, in particular, broadcasters. Or even when you put them into cinemas, you have to work so hard to get an audience to come and see them, even though you know they'll enjoy it because it's full of humour, it's full of drama, it's full of passion. So you've got to be quite strong-willed to kind of persist with that and find your own little ways of manoeuvring. Shuaib, my co-director, who is very important, did a lot of the filming, especially towards the end. Very, very experienced. He has been kidnapped, and that was very scary for him. But again, you know, you just have to take precautions. None of it really compares to the trials and tribulations that Mir has been through. So, you know, even after the incident that I had with the Taliban, and the next day I was at Kabul airport. Actually, the airport was snowed in, but I did manage to get the last flight out to do, and then within 24 hours I'm in Dubai in a completely different world. Mir is left behind. So Shuaib and I are not the story. And when people want to talk about, you know, what was it like filming and the difficulties, I try to steer away from that because it's Mir's the story, Afghanistan's the story. So what's his situation now? Mir is Hazara, and that means, pretty much means that he is Shia. Again, to understand Afghanistan, you have to understand there are 4 very distinct ethnicities. There are some others, but you've got Tajiks and Uzbeks and Pashtuns and Hazara Shia. The Hazara are a very significant minority, but by being Shia, under the last Taliban regime, it was pretty nasty, it was very nasty between the Pashtun Sunni, and particularly the Sunnis coming from places like Yemen and Saudi and the Pakistan, who were a bit more extreme, really went after the Hazara. So there is a risk to any Hazara right now. Secondly, he's a journalist now, as you mentioned. So the Taliban at the moment are saying, journalists can continue. We're not telling you to stop being journalists, but you know, there have been instances already where journalists filming on the streets, particularly when there's been small demonstrations, have been pushed about, have been beaten. So how safe it is, we don't know. Whether he is impacted by being in the film is obviously something we've thought about a lot, talked to him about a lot. And at the moment, his view and Shuaib's view, who's still in Kabul, is that is not an issue. You know, he's obviously been fully aware of the film. He's seen the film many times. If he wanted to take something out because it put him at risk, we would have taken it out. It's his narration, it's his voice. So that at the moment is not an issue. I think the impact of visual images or of social media or of films is something we really have to consider very hard. You know, it's very easy to make films and over-exaggerate their impact. On completing a film, a whole new chapter of a film begins, which is the distribution of that film. Getting people to see it, getting people to be impacted by it. We have this discussion in my company all the time in terms of social media. So we put things out on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. What actually is the impact? Cumulatively, you can tell that things have an impact on people, but an individual story, who's actually reading it? So let's take the example of this film. This is a 20-year project. It is actually unique. I don't know of another film where somebody's followed a child growing up over 20 years. Boyhood, which was a fictional feature film over 14 years. I watched it again recently. All that really happens is that he gets older. There's no real story, particularly. The famous British series 7 Up, which has been repeated in other countries, but they only go and film every 7 years. It's longitudinal, but it's not every year. So It's a film about youth. It's a film about growing up, irrespective of it being in Afghanistan. But more importantly, it's a film that shows you the impact on one child. And if I'd have chosen another one of those 5 boys that I met on day one, it would have been a slightly different film, but the essential truth of it would have remained the same, which is, what did we achieve and what didn't we achieve, and what lessons are there moving forwards? Anyone that says Afghanistan is just the same now because the Taliban are back in power and it's just like the end of the 1990s is talking rubbish. Afghanistan has changed. One small example, I just mentioned social media, is that when I first went, there was no mobile phones. Now everybody has mobile phones. You saw the Taliban retaking Kabul airport. They've all got mobile phones. I can talk to Mir in half an hour if I want to. As soon as I finish this, I could talk to him on WhatsApp or FaceTime, or I could call him. Because of linguistic difficulties, we don't tend to speak in that way. So what one hopes is that somehow a film like this will be seen and people will be informed. It's why I find it's so important to have cinema screenings, because then I can actually, for me as a filmmaker, I can actually feel people being impacted. And particularly if I'm there doing a Q&A, I can answer questions and I know that people have been moved. There is a real value of this film to Afghans themselves, which I only really realized on the previous film I made about Mir. Because Afghans started coming to see it and they absolutely loved it, because there's nothing like it for Afghans. We've got plenty of films about the way we live. Afghans don't. Certainly not in 2011, which was the previous film. And they loved seeing themselves on the big screen and later on television or on DVD, and seeing the intimacy of family life, which they had simply never seen before, ever. I have not been surprised by what has happened in Afghanistan, in the sense of the Taliban taking over the country. And it rather amazes me that anybody who was working in Afghanistan or had a role to play with Afghanistan says that they were surprised, because I wasn't, so they shouldn't have been. As soon as Trump last year basically agreed his withdrawal with the Taliban, in the absence of the democratically elected Afghan government, that was curtains for that government, and it meant that, the Taliban knew at that point that they'd won. The scramble around Kabul airport was very unseemly, sad, unnecessary. I think that basically the Americans, broadly speaking, the Americans just wanted to, once they'd made the decision to leave, once Biden had reconfirmed that, they only really had thoughts for themselves. There hadn't actually been an American soldier killed for 2 years. And there were only a few thousand there. And if you compare that to the thousands that are still in Germany, you could make an argument that these troops could have stayed without causing too much fuss. You can also make the argument that actually it's time for all foreign troops to leave. Afghanistan's very complicated. But what is absolutely clear was that it didn't need to end in the way that it ended, with human beings, no different to you and me, going through really the most dreadful times at the airport. 180 were killed in a suicide bomb. Again, human beings like you and me having to wade through a river of sewage with what little they had with them, rucksacks, maybe a suitcase, desperately trying to fight their way onto an aircraft. It amazes me that any got out at all, and there's plenty that didn't. That didn't need to happen. But actually it is all about passion. It is about just that sense of, I can't do anything else, I just have to do this. This was just this one project was actually extremely difficult. And had it not been for a fantastic commissioning editor at WDR, I wouldn't have finished it. It was just too many problems, not least funding, which is a major issue for films like this. But ultimately, it is passion, and I see it within my own company. I see people who want to be filmmakers, and I sometimes can tell that they just don't quite have the passion. And the passion means that when someone says no, you think, oh, you said no, I'm going to go around, I'm going to go a different way. I'm not going to be put off by you. I will do what I'm going to do, taking in advice and influences. And I've actually ended up making, over the past 35 years, not deliberately really, but the majority of my 250 films have actually been biography. So I've made 4 films about composers. So again, this part of the world, Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, Chopin. I'm just working on my 30th feature film about an artist, Rembrandt, Van Gogh, Caravaggio, Michelangelo. The one thing they all have is this insatiable passion, not for wealth, not for status, but just to be as good as they can be in their chosen career, in their chosen métier. And I think that's what fuels me, is this desire. You can never stop learning. You can never stop trying to make something that is better.